So thank you for the opportunity to talk to the department. So I'm Patrick Brown. In addition to being a lecturer here in the department, I am the co-director of the Climate and Energy team at the Breakthrough Institute, which is a nonprofit that does research on technological solutions to environmental problems. And I'm also a member of the Wildfire Interdisciplinary Research Center at San Jose State University. And so this is not really going to be a research seminar. This is going to be about a situation I was involved in the fall, where I published a paper in the journal Nature called Climate Warming Increases Extreme Daily Wildfire Growth Risk in California. And I, subsequent to that, published an op-ed in the Free Press called I Left Out the Full Truth to Get My Climate Change Paper Published. I just got published in Nature because I stuck to a narrative I knew the editors would like. That's not the way science should work. And so this caused quite a kind of firestorm, is the word that the Los Angeles Times used. And so kind of this is exemplified by this like national media coverage. So it talks about in the Washington Post, LA Times, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic. It was discussed on the floor of the Senate. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about like the personal story behind this, but more just really expanding on the ideas that I was trying to bring to light in this op-ed. And so the title here is, Does High-Profile Science Convey the Full Story on the Climate Problem? And so what this op-ed was really doing was making a critique of the environment around high-impact scientific publishing and the incentives surrounding researchers, and also a critique of myself, essentially, for succumbing to some of those incentives. And by high-impact scientific publishing, that's basically exemplified by publishing in the most characteristic journals that would be considered high impact, like Nature and Science. One thing I want to make clear at the outset here is the timeline, that this was not a sting operation or a hoax or something like that. So I did not submit this paper to Nature with the intent of later critiquing it. There was like a 3-year period between when I started doing the research that became this paper and when it was published. And over that time period, I kind of had this growing frustration that I felt like I couldn't take the high-profile literature at face value. And I started kind of thinking and writing more about that and about misaligned incentives in scientific publishing as this paper was going through peer review. And I basically, as it was getting over the finish line, I decided that I shouldn't just be kind of critiquing the field overall and other people's work. I should critique my own work or use my own paper as an example of some of the criticisms that I wanted to bring to light. So the thesis of this op-ed can kind of be encapsulated by this cartoon. So this cartoon predates my op-ed, but I didn't know it existed before I wrote my op-ed. Someone sent it to me after. Yeah, it's a nice encapsulation of what I'm saying. So on the left side, we have 19th century scientist. I must find the explanation for this phenomena in order to truly understand nature. And 21st century scientist, I must get the results that fits my narrative so I can get my paper into Nature. So this is like, it's much more subtle than something that would traditionally be called like scientific misconduct or something like that. It's not like falsifying data. It's a more subtle thing. And so to kind of flesh out the thesis a little bit more, I would say that there's substantial incentives to publish in high-impact journals like Science and Nature. And if you're a climate impacts researcher, basically the highest return on investment is to frame research to at least implicitly support what has become the predominant narrative. And what I would define as the predominant narrative would basically just be in support of the temperature limits, like the 1.5 degree temperature limit that's part of the Paris Agreement. And so one way of putting that would be to say that the benefits of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius far outweigh the costs. And so there's energy researchers and there's climate impacts researchers, but if you're on the climate impact side and you kind of want to be in line with this, what you do is you seek out and highlight negative impacts of climate change. And so what I think is that these incentives basically distort the aggregate output of the high impact literature. And I think that it leaves out a good portion of the full story. And in particular, I think that there's basically too much focus on emissions reductions. And this comes at the expense of looking at adaptation options, and it sidelines legitimate concerns about overly restrictive energy policies, especially for low-income countries. So this idea of seeking out and highlighting negative impacts of climate change it's a subtle thing about how research questions are devised. And so it basically orients research questions in a way that, rather than ask, say, like, what is the magnitude of the influence of climate change on the phenomena I'm studying relative to all other influences? Or what is the net influence of the current energy system on the phenomena I'm studying, like, for example, human deaths from non-optimal temperatures? It's more prudent to ask, if you're a researcher in the field and you want to be published in a high-impact journal, how does climate change negatively impact the phenomena I'm studying? And this is what I did in my paper. So, wildfire, it's well known that wildfire changes are the result of many different causal factors that are also changing. But I chose to just look at one of those causal factors. So this is a diagram showing all of the different interactions. But this paper, Climate Warming Increases Extreme Daily Wildfire Growth Risk in California, just focused on one of those causal factors. So that's basically this. So fossil fuel emissions to the climate system, to its influence on weather, and then downstream of that, wildfire behavior. And I chose not to bring in all of these other causal factors. I chose to hold those constant, like land use change and changes in fuels and changes in ignitions and changes in suppressing cultural burning from indigenous people, those types of things. Those are all well known to affect wildfire behavior, but I chose not to bring those in because I knew that it would kind of muddy the waters and dilute this clean story and make it less likely to get into a high impact journal. So I'm just going to take the rest of the time here to expand on several of these points that I'm trying to make in this op-ed. And they can basically be divided into 5 categories. So the first is just the desirability of high impact publications. Second is, given that they're desirable, how do researchers kind of maximize the chance of publication? I want to talk a little bit about the interaction between science and policy and how I don't think that's just a unidirectional one-way interaction. Talk a little bit about what I think is left out from the high-profile scientific literature in aggregate, and how we can make kind of more room for the full story to be represented there. So first, just this desirability of high-impact publications. I think it's important for people to know that are outside of academic publishing that peer-reviewed publications are the most important accomplishments on a researcher's CV or resume. And so you want your research to be read, because if it's not read, it's basically the same thing as not having done it at all. What is the best way to get your research read? Well, the best way is to get it into a high-impact venue. So high-impact papers get the most attention. And so as part of a piece I'm writing for the Chronicle of Higher Education, I've compiled a couple of databases, and one is looking at the 50 climate change papers that received the most online attention over the past 5 years. And so there's hundreds of journals that you can publish in, but 64% of these top 50 were just from Science and Nature and their subjournals, and 86% were from what would be considered high-impact journals if you include PNAS and The Lancet. So it's pretty clear that if you want your paper to get attention, where you should be aiming in terms of the venue. And that's important from a researcher's career prospect perspective, because getting more attention gets your research in front of other researchers, and that makes them more likely to cite your research. And it's really citations more than raw paper counts that are the main figures of merit for researchers. And so I see that with my previous Nature paper from 2017, that has 4 times the citations of my next most cited paper. So that's how this can kind of indirectly affect your career as a researcher, but there's also just direct effects. And that has been acknowledged in the pages of Nature, actually, in this column, Why Does a High-Impact Publication Matter So Much for a Career in Research? Where they note that people applying to faculty positions are 6 times more likely to receive an offer if they have a paper in one of these high-impact venues. Other research has corroborated the same idea that this is looking at decisions on review, promotion, and tenure. So when you're like an assistant professor and you're going up to be promoted to full professor, they say, we conclude the use of journal impact factor is encouraged in review, promotion, and tenure evaluations. And here's another one just kind of basically saying the same thing. Most agree review, promotion, and tenure requirements should encourage peer-reviewed works of high quality, but in practice, the value of publication is often assessed using shortcuts such as the prestige of the publication venue, rather than on the quality and rigor of peer review of each individual item. So it's desirable, and that means that these journals can be highly selective. So Nature only publishes about 8% of submissions, and Science publishes 6% of submissions. And so that means placing your research there is highly competitive, and it means that you are going to essentially sell your research to the journal. And that's actually the word that Nature uses on its website. So it says that you should submit a cover letter and sell your research to the journal. And one of the reasons that your research might get rejected is that it's not enough impact. It's not worthy of enough attention. But of course, as you know, a savvy researcher is not going to start selling the research just at the point of submission to the journal. You're going to start selling it. You're going to start thinking about it at the inception of the research, like when you're going back, when you're thinking about the research question in the first place. So when kind of thinking about the research question, how do researchers align their research questions in a way to kind of maximize the chance of publication? One good strategy would just be to align your research with the high-level messaging espoused by the leadership of the journals. And so this is an example of high-level messaging espoused by the leadership of Science. This is Marcia McNutt, the editor-in-chief of Science at the time. She wrote an editorial published in Science called the Beyond 2 Degree Inferno. This is an op-ed that has kind of a lot of moral language, pretty passionate. She describes different types of human behavior as being sinners or not. She says, I wonder where in the 9 circles Dante would place all of us who are borrowing against this earth in the name of economic growth, accumulating an environmental debt by burning fossil fuels. So does this suggest that Science might be kind of more sympathetic to some types of research or some types of research conclusions than others? I think that it does. Similarly, Nature has done things like officially endorse Joe Biden for president for, among other reasons, climate change reasons. Biden would return the United States to the Paris Agreement, and is proposing the most ambitious domestic climate policies ever advocated by nominees from the country's major parties. Now, I feel like I shouldn't have to say this, but I will. I voted for Joe Biden. I'm going to vote for Joe Biden again. I've only ever voted for Democrats in national and state elections. But still, this makes me very uncomfortable that Nature as an institution would officially endorse candidates like this. And so again, the rhetorical question is that, suggest that Nature might be more sympathetic to certain research or certain research conclusions than others. I think that it does. And Nature did get some pushback for this, and they subsequently doubled down. And this is Holden Thorpe, who's the current editor-in-chief of Science, basically defending Nature's decision to endorse policies and politicians on Twitter. So he's basically saying, if Science and Nature don't go all the way to endorsing particular policies and politicians, this gives people permission to say things like, climate change may be real, but I don't think we should have government regulation to deal with it, which is unacceptable. So he's basically saying he thinks Science kind of subsumes everything all the way through to particular policies and politicians. And so whether or not you agree with that, I think it's very clear that Science and Nature are explicitly endorsing policies and politicians. So, one question that would come up here is, but aren't these statements just emanating from, directly from the science? So I want to talk about that for a second, about kind of the potential interaction between science and policy. So I think what Holden Thorpe is articulating there is this very idealized vision of science. It's kind of something like this, where you have reality and you have researchers with this like direct line to reality, and they publish their results in journals, and then that can kind of flow directly into policy, and we call that like evidence-based policy. And it's this kind of idea that like researchers are sequestered away from society and are robots. And there's certain attributes that I think are great attributes to have as goals for researchers under this model. Be curious but disinterested in the particulars of the results. You don't actually care the way that the results come out. Dispassionate, amoral, so not immoral, but amoral, not bringing a bunch of subjective, normative, moral judgments into your research. Empirical and purely truth-seeking. And I think that we teach these in graduate school, and these are actually articulated pretty well in Dr. Zachary's document on developing and writing a research project in energy and environmental sciences. So he talks about in that scientific research following the scientific method, which is largely about falsifiable hypothesis tests. And then there's, attributes of what a scientist should be: curious, asking good questions, objective, strive to produce results in a non-biased way. So I think we can strive for that, but I don't think that that's necessarily how it works in practice or how it's working currently in practice. So I would kind of suggest this alternative model where there's still reality and there's still kind of information flows through researchers and scientific journals, and it gets to policy, but I think it's much more mediated by the media and the public. But more importantly, there are these feedbacks, these social feedbacks between all of these entities. And on the bottom here, I think that there is, a feedback from policy into the minds of researchers and into scientific journals. And we might call that policy-based evidence making. I see also when researchers and journals are not sequestered away from society and are part of society, and we are humans and social animals, I see actually a lot of morality, where I think the ideal is amoral, looking at facts as much as you can. But I see a lot of morality. I see a lot of good team, bad team type thinking, where the good team is essentially working to save the planet, and the bad team is working to undermine those goals, either out of ignorance or greed or some combination of the two. And so that type of thinking is in conflict with pure truth seeking. And so I think that that's kind of part of the problem, and what ends up being supportive of this policy-based evidence. So a little bit more kind of evidence for there being policy-based evidence going on would be that the predominant policy that we're talking about, like the 2 degrees Celsius temperature limit, that actually predates all sophisticated studies of impacts from climate change. So the 2C limit was first proposed in 1977, largely because it was a round number that seemed technologically and economically feasible. And one of the main reasons that it was used was it was the estimated maximum experienced temperature over the past 100,000 years. And this has just kind of been running in the background as climate change impact science has emerged. And so my claim is that climate impact science has emerged in this environment, and it's basically always been easier to do research that supports that policy goal, at least directionally, than research that undermines it. And so what this has led to, this may surprise some people, that the 2C goal and the 1.5C goal are not limits that just sprung from the science. It's not that the science first came up with those and then it was incorporated into policy. It was really more the other way around. And this is acknowledged in the pages of Nature Geoscience, in this paper, A Scientific Critique of the 2-degree Climate Change Target, where these authors are actually coming at this from the direction of 2C is too high and it should be lower, which I think is why it's in Nature. But I bring it up to agree with it on some of these points, that this 2C warming target is perceived by the public as a universally accepted goal identified by scientists as a safe limit that avoids dangerous climate change. This perception is incorrect. No scientific assessment has clearly justified or defended the 2C target, and it's not a problem that science alone can address. So I think that has led to this environment where we have kind of policy-based evidence making, and it causes certain things to be left out. So going back to this, the way that it causes researchers to orient their research questions, and then, that it's more prudent to ask, how does climate change negatively impact the phenomena I'm studying? I'll just give you some examples of this. So this became very apparent to me when I encountered this paper published in Nature in 2018 called Large Potential Reduction in Economic Damages from Under UN Mitigation Targets. And so this is a paper explicitly framed in support, of the predominant policy. And it says, our results therefore suggest that achieving the 1.5 degrees Celsius target is likely to reduce aggregate damages and lessen global inequality, and failing to meet the 2C target is likely to increase economic damages substantially. And so this was covered with pretty generous headlines like limiting temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius could result in 30 trillion of savings for global economy, study shows. And you may be kind of surprised to learn from reading this headline or even reading this title that this was not actually a cost-benefit analysis. So you kind of have to know the jargon of this literature to know that economic damages only refers to the climate impacts damages side of things and doesn't refer to the mitigation costs or abatement costs. So this is just looking at one side of the ledger. And so my contention would be that a disinterested literature, a totally fair literature, it's fine if this could get through as long as kind of the opposite thing could also get through. And there are papers that just focus on mitigation costs and abatement costs, but they're not framed in the same way, like undermining the policy goal. So a paper that was like the reciprocal of this would be a title like Large Potential Damage to World Economy Under UN Mitigation Targets. And I'd venture to say that is impossible for a paper like that to be published in Nature. And it's not because it's not factually correct. I mean, you could calculate that and have that be the title of a paper, but it's just not possible to get that through because it's too transgressive to the predominant narrative. And so I knew that a cost-only analysis like that wouldn't get through, but I did think that Nature might be interested in a paper that looked at the net economic impact of these UN global warming mitigation targets. And so I took these damage estimates and I parameterized them into a model that weighed them against mitigation costs or abatement costs. And my paper was called Net Economic Impact of UN Global Warming Targets, so net meaning cost-benefit analysis. And this is the cover letter that I submitted to Nature. So we submitted the paper to Nature. What our results showed was that when you include the mitigation costs, it basically flips the conclusions. So we found that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius results in a net loss of gross world product relative to 2 degrees Celsius, and even a net loss relative to a no mitigation scenario. So we submitted that to Nature. That was desk rejected by Nature. So what that means is that it was rejected prior to peer review, so not for any technical reasons. And we got kind of a boilerplate reason, that it's not of sufficient interest to the readership of Nature, or not a sufficient advance. But I kind of find that implausible that it wouldn't be of sufficient interest, because this is, to me, the most interesting thing in all of climate science, whether the predominant policy pencils out from a cost-benefit perspective. So I would say that it's probably more likely that it was the results that were unwelcome rather than the topic of the study. And so this paper was eventually published just under a longer name and in a less prestigious venue in PLOS 1. But all of those conclusions did survive peer review in the literature. But just a couple more examples of the type of thing I'm talking about here, of orienting your research question in a way that supports the policy. This is a paper in Nature Climate Change called The Burden of Heat-Related Mortality Attributable to Recent Human-Induced Climate Change. And this is, again, just looking at the negative side of the ledger. So just looking at heat-related mortality and saying our findings support the urgent need for more ambitious mitigation. But of course, people die of heat and cold, and actually cold deaths outnumber heat deaths globally by quite a bit. Some estimates are like 9-1. And so again, it would be fine for this to be in the high impact literature if it was also okay to just look at cold deaths, because that would demonstrate a disinterested, fair literature. And so then the reciprocal of this would be something like a study that concludes with our findings throw into question some of the benefits of the most stringent climate policies, as they might slow the reduction in cold-related deaths. But again, that is, in my estimation, impossible for a statement like that to make it into the literature. And again, it's not because it's factually incorrect. It's just too transgressive. Here's another example. This is now in the realm of food. This is a paper in Nature Food called Climate Impacts on Global Agriculture Emerge Earlier in New Generation of Climate and Crop Models. So this kind of gives a negative connotation because the word impacts has a negative connotation. But if you actually look at the results of the study, the results are pretty equivocal. So basically what they show is that warming and CO2 increases reduce corn yields, but they increase wheat yields. They're basically flat on soybean yields and potentially a slight increase in rice yields. So a paper could be framed around these positive portions of it. But no, the paper is framed in kind of the most negative light possible. These results suggest that major breadbasket regions will face distinct anthropogenic climate risks sooner than previously anticipated. And so I could kind of go on for days showing examples like this. But I do want to say that I'm not just cherry picking examples. And so as part of this piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education, I have this other database that looks at these patterns in the top 50 climate change related studies from Science and Nature over the past 5 years as ranked by Google Scholar. So what you'll see there is that the majority of these studies are framed in a way that at least implicitly supports, at least directionally, the predominant narrative or the Paris Agreement. So very few studies adopt an optimistic tone leaning into historical increases in human resilience to climate, which are basically ubiquitous when you look at actual impacts on people, or an adaptive capacity of ecosystems. And I think this is really important that no studies use pessimistic or warning-oriented messaging around overly stringent restrictions on current energy and agriculture systems. So there's lots of studies that use pessimistic or warning-oriented messaging around impacts from climate change, but none that are kind of warning about potentially being overly restrictive on current energy and agriculture systems. So I'll take these in turn and talk a little bit more why I think that's a problem. So for this first one, I'll just use this paper as an example. Anthropogenic climate change has slowed global agricultural productivity growth. So again, kind of go back to this question, how does climate change negatively impact the phenomena I'm studying? Where what they're actually showing is that agriculture productivity, so this is total factor productivity, it's measured as the amount of output per unit input in dollars. But what they're showing is that agriculture has gotten 89% more productive since the 1960s, early 1960s. And their main result is that were it not for climate change, it would have gotten 110% more productive. And so what I think is happening here, though, what's left out, is that this really sidelines the fact that the net result of carbon-intensive agriculture and the energy systems that undergird that is an 89% increase in productivity. And this is in the paper. I mean, it's kind of it's a caveat. It's like one or two sentences in the paper where they say, our results should not be interpreted as the effect of a world without fossil fuels. Agriculture has benefited tremendously from agricultural research and carbon-intensive inputs that would not have been available without fossil fuels. So this is acknowledged in the paper, but again, it's all framed in this very negative light. And I think that in aggregate causes a distortion for what is produced by the high-impact literature. Specific problems are that it represents an opportunity cost in terms of the lack of studying exactly why agriculture has gotten 89% more productive overall, and lack of kind of publicizing the reasons for that. And it makes the current systems seem less attractive than they actually are, and easier to condemn them. So this other point, no studies using pessimistic or warning-oriented messaging around overly stringent restrictions on current energy and agriculture systems. So it's just the case that high energy consumption, high GDP, and yes, high CO2 emission societies are more resilient to the climate. And so you can just see this pretty obviously in pictures, that this is a picture of Singapore, a high energy consumption society, and this is a picture of a slum in India, which is low energy consumption. And it's just very clear where you'd want to be, where you'd want to be period, but where you'd want to be during a 12-inch deluge rainstorm, that this society is going to be much less sensitive to climate and to climate change than this one. And this is borne out in the literature. So this is one paper of many that have looked at this type of thing. And one of their conclusions is hazard mortality from floods, droughts, and storms is 15 times higher in these, how they define as vulnerable countries, but it's basically low energy, low GDP, low income countries. So you're 15 times more likely to die from the same hazard, the same type of flood or drought or storm in an area like this, which I don't think should be surprising. And so with current technology, it is still the case that per capita energy consumption, which is basically what you're seeing here, is still heavily correlated with per capita CO2 emissions. The point here is that humanity, in my estimation, humanity needs much more energy. We need to bring a lot of the low-income areas away from this and towards this. But carbon budgets associated with, for example, the 1.5 degree Celsius limit necessarily puts huge restrictions on the energy options for humanity. And so this 1.5 limit is stringent, it's very dramatic. So this is the historical emissions, and then this is the pathway that emissions would need to be on to reach that limit by the end of the century. Just to kind of appreciate how steep this is, this little blip here is the downturn from COVID, so from the economic downturn from COVID and from lockdowns. That was about a 5% reduction in CO2 emissions. And of course it wouldn't be done in the same way, but still that same 5% reduction would have to be compounded every single year for the remainder of the century until emissions go negative. And so that's a huge ask. It's a huge reorientation of global society. And all I'm saying is that it should not be sold under false pretenses, and the literature should reflect that there are major risks in this so that we fully understand what the cost-benefit calculation is. So how I think we can kind of make more room then for the full story to be represented in the high-impact literature. So one thing I think that we should strive to do in climate science and environmental science is look for a cultural shift away from this good team versus bad team thinking. So I experienced in rapid succession what it's like to be on the good team and what it's like to be on the bad team. So after I published my paper in Nature, I was on the good team. So I do think this would be another talk, but I think there's a lot of good things in this paper. And so when it came out, I was doing a bunch of interviews on the paper. This is before I published the op-ed. And during that time, I'm treated in this very friendly way. I did over a dozen interviews, and people treat you as this very important person with interesting things to say. And I was even sent a solicitation to have my paper printed on a mug as a kind of trophy. Congratulations on your newly published paper in Nature, Climate Warming Increases Extreme Daily Wildfire Growth Risk in California. So that all rapidly changed when I was put on the bad team after I published the op-ed. And so there was a lot of public condemnation. My Twitter feed was quite brutal. And so there's just some examples of public condemnation. I'm a former contributor to Skeptical Science, but so they say Patrick Brown's recycled hallucination of climate science. So they talk about that in Carbon Brief. A bunch of quotes from other scientists pouring cold water on my claims of journal bias. This one, Patrick Brown's stunt takes climate change denial to a new plateau. So that was all unpleasant. But I will say that while there was public condemnation, I was getting a lot of private support from other academics, from other researchers who agreed with me. So things like, it takes a lot of guts to do what you did, you're advancing science, thank you, well done for taking a courageous stand to defend the standards of research integrity. So I only bring this up just to highlight this dichotomy of public condemnation and private support, because I think what this demonstrates is that there's a lot of self-censorship going on, that the people that are supporting me privately don't want to do so publicly because they don't want to be criticized publicly. This was brought up recently in a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education called Science as a Censorship Problem, where they're talking about kind of a lot of self-censorship in science. They cite a survey that says 16% of faculty have been disciplined or threatened with discipline for their teaching, research, talks, or non-academic publications, basically for things that are kind of controversial or unorthodox. And so I think Johns Hopkins for not threatening to discipline me for my unorthodox writing. But down here, I think this is quite alarming, actually, that 34% of professors have been pressured by peers to avoid controversial research. 25% reported being very or extremely likely to self-censor in academic publications, and 91% reported being at least somewhat likely to self-censor in academic publications, meetings, presentations, or on social media. So I think these numbers are very concerning, that they represent a major problem if we want academic scientists to be oriented as much as possible towards truth-seeking. So some kind of specific suggestions for reform. This is something that's been adopted much more recently in psychology research, but I think climate research should do this as well, and that's the more widespread adoption of pre-registration of studies. So that's when research papers are accepted based on research questions and proposed methodology before the results are known. And so I think that would help induce more neutral research questions, and it would reduce the impulse to adjust your research question or your methods to kind of increase the likelihood of a high-profile publication. Some other suggestions I'm going to steal from this paper that was what that Chronicle of Higher Education piece was about. This is a paper in PNAS, and it's called Pro-Social Motives Underlie Scientific Censorship by Scientists, a Perspective and Research Agenda, which, by the way, scientific censorship sounds very nefarious, but it's just defined as any actions aimed at obstructing particular scientific ideas from reaching an audience for reasons other than low scientific quality. So two of their suggestions are, the first one is publish reviews and editor decisions for rejected manuscripts. So it's becoming more and more common to publish editor decisions and reviews for accepted manuscripts, but because the goal of censorship is to prevent publication, you want to be able to see those rejection decisions and be able to scrutinize them. And so that would kind of increase accountability for reviewers and editors, and hopefully facilitate the study of the decisions for rejected manuscripts. So along those same lines of studying those decisions, journals should embrace audits that essentially attest for bias. So that would mean like a third party submits a paper or submits different versions of a paper with identical methods but manipulated results to see if methods are scrutinized differently depending on the results. And so hopefully what that would lead to is if you had metrics that are essentially measuring the non-bias of journals, that journals would kind of wear that as a badge, and that could be their primary metric that they advertise, where right now the primary metric that they advertise is impact factor, or how much attention the research gets, how much citations the research gets. So they put it like metrics of editorial practice quality, fairness, commitment to truth, and socio-political independence would be kind of badges of honor for journals. So the last suggestion I have is messaging from the high levels at the journals. So we've had special issues and op-eds soliciting research in support of the predominant narrative. So why not special issues and op-eds soliciting research outside of the predominant narrative? So specifically, I'm talking about research that kind of leans into successful resilience to climate with the goal of fostering more of it, and research on legitimate potential negative impacts of overly restrictive energy policy. And so I think this would kind of loosen the grip of this good team, bad team thinking if you had this kind of top-down infrastructure soliciting this, and foster a more honest and complete scientific literature that I think would be more useful to society. And I think that it would move us a little bit away from this thing that I'm critiquing here, this policy-based evidence, and towards the ideal that we'd like science to be at. Thank you, and happy to field questions.